My name is Vivian Cross, and I'm 44 years old. To my husband's family, I have always been the girl he married beneath himself, the county clerk's daughter who got lucky. What none of them ever bothered to learn in 11 years of holiday dinners is what I actually do for a living. They think I process paperwork downtown. They have never once asked me what building I walk into every morning. And 3 weeks ago, in the kitchen of the house they bought for us, my mother-in-law put both hands on my shoulders and told me to tell the police I was driving. Welcome back to Hidden Reckoning Stories, where the quiet ones keep the receipts and nobody stays underestimated forever. If you like watching a family find out exactly who they married, subscribe, because what happens in this one, they never saw coming. Let me take you back to the night it started, because you need to understand the family before you can understand what they tried to do to me. I sit on the federal bench for the Northern District, appointed 4 years ago after a decade as a prosecutor before that. Nobody outside my chambers and my clerk knows that, not because I'm hiding it, but because the Averys never asked. In 11 years, not one of them has asked me a single question about my career that wasn't really a question about my husband's. What's it like watching Grant build his firm? Must be nice, the flexible hours, government work. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, because correcting people who've already decided who you are is exhausting, and because, if I'm honest, some small, tired part of me liked having one room in my life where nobody was performing for the judge. That Friday started ordinary. I'd spent the morning in chambers finishing an opinion, the afternoon in a settlement conference that ran long, and I got home to Grant's car already in the driveway, which was strange, because Grant never left the office before 7. He was standing in the kitchen with his phone in his hand, and a look on his face I recognized from 10 years of watching defendants realize the evidence had already been collected. There was an accident, he said, on Belmont. I need you to listen to me before you say anything. He'd been driving home from the club, he told me, 3 glasses of wine into a Friday afternoon he wasn't supposed to admit to, and a man had stepped off the curb near the crosswalk on Belmont and Ash. Grant said the man came out of nowhere. Grant said he panicked. Grant said he kept driving for 4 blocks before he could make himself pull over and think, and by then it was too late to go back, because going back meant admitting he hadn't stopped in the first place, and a man was on the ground, and somebody had already called it in. I want to be precise about this part, because precision is the entire architecture of what I do for a living. My husband did not tell me the man was fine. He did not tell me he'd called 911. He told me the make of his own car, and the fact that the front bumper had a hairline crack he'd already covered with a magnet from the hardware store, and then he told me his parents were on their way over. That should have been the first thing that told me everything. Not the accident. The fact that his instinct, standing over a stranger he'd hit and left, was to call his mother. Eleanor and Walter Avery arrived at our house 11 minutes later, which tells you they must have left before Grant finished the sentence he was saying to his mother on the phone. Eleanor came through my own front door without knocking, the way she always has, the way that used to bother me and had long since become just weather. Walter stayed by the door with his coat still on, checking his watch like the accident was an inconvenience scheduled into his evening. I want you to picture this. A man was on the ground on Belmont Avenue. A hospital somewhere had his name on a chart, and the first conversation in my kitchen that night was not about him. Here's what we're going to do, Eleanor said, and she said it the way she says everything, like a woman reading out a decision that had already been made in a room I wasn't in. Grant cannot be the one who is driving. You understand that, don't you, Vivian? He has the firm. He has partners whose names are on that letterhead, right next to his. If this touches him, it touches 30 other families who depend on that firm. I asked her what, exactly, she thought the alternative was. She walked across my kitchen, put both hands on my shoulders the way you'd steady a child before a shot at the doctor's office, and said it plainly, like she was doing me a kindness by saying it plainly instead of dressing it up. Just tell them you were driving. I have stood in courtrooms and watched people lie under oath for lower stakes than this. I have sentenced men for less than what my mother-in-law was asking me to volunteer for over a plate of untouched dinner rolls. I said, quietly, that a man was hurt, that this wasn't a parking ticket, that what she was describing was a felony, and I was not simply going to absorb it because it was convenient for the firm's letterhead. Walter finally spoke from the doorway, still in his coat, like he hadn't fully committed to staying. He has a career to protect, he said. You have nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. 11 years of Christmas dinners where I was handed the vegetable dish to carry because nobody trusted me with a turkey. 11 years of Walter introducing me at the country club as Grant's wife, without a name attached, like I was a fixture that came with the house. And now, standing in my own kitchen, the thing they had always believed about me, that I was decorative, dispensable, a placeholder with no career worth protecting, was the entire foundation of the plan. Grant hadn't said a word since his parents walked in. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and when I looked at him, waiting for him to tell his mother this wasn't happening, he didn't. He just watched, the way you watch a negotiation you expect to win. "Grant," I said. "Say something." He uncrossed his arms. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, not a cruel smile. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it, an almost fond smile. The smile of a man who has never once doubted how a room was going to end. "Who'd believe you anyway?" he said. That was the last mistake he ever made. I didn't answer him that night. I want you to understand that the silence that followed wasn't defeat. I have sat through enough depositions to know that the person who speaks first in a room like that usually loses. I picked at my coat. I told Grant I was going to check on the man from the accident, and nobody in that kitchen stopped me, because none of them had thought to ask his name yet. His name was Marcus Whitfield, 51 years old, a maintenance supervisor at the community college, walking home from a shift when a car clipped him at Belmont and Ash and didn't stop. He had a fractured pelvis and a concussion, and he was going to live, and the responding officer had already logged a partial plate and a paint transfer sample before I ever walked into that emergency room waiting area. I didn't identify myself to anyone that night. I sat 2 rows from his daughter, who was 22 and terrified and furious in the particular way people are furious when the person who did this to their father simply drove away, and I listened. The next morning, I did the one thing the Averys never accounted for because they had spent 11 years deciding I wasn't the kind of person who did anything at all. I called the district attorney's office, not as a favor, not as a judge leaning on a case, but to formally recuse myself in advance from anything in my courtroom that might ever touch this matter, and to make absolutely certain the record showed I had done so before a single filing existed. Then I called a lawyer. Not for me. For Marcus Whitfield, because a hit-and-run victim with a fractured pelvis and a maintenance worker's insurance was exactly the kind of person a firm like Grant's was built to outlast in a courtroom, and I was not going to let that happen quietly in a house I paid half the mortgage on. Eleanor called 4 times that Saturday. I let it go to voicemail each time, and on the 4th, her tone had shifted from instruction to something closer to panic, because word travels fast in a town like ours, and somebody at the club had mentioned that police were asking questions on Belmont, and that the paint transfer matched a very particular shade of navy that Grant's dealership had special ordered 18 months ago. Grant showed up at my chambers on Monday morning. He had never once, in 11 years, come to my building. He stood in my clerk's outer office in his suit, visibly rattled to discover that the receptionist called me Judge Cross, without a flicker of hesitation, and when he finally sat down across from my desk, the fondness from Friday night was gone. What replaced it was something closer to fear. "You didn't tell them," he said, "that I was driving. You just let it sit." I told him I hadn't told anyone anything. I told him the truth had never needed my help. It had simply been waiting for someone in that family to stop managing it. He asked me, and his voice cracked on it in a way I hadn't heard from him since his father's stroke 3 years earlier, what I was planning to do. "Nothing," I said. "That's the part none of you understood. I was never going to lie for you, Grant. I was also never going to lie against you. I was just going to stop being quiet." He asked what that meant. I told him it meant Marcus Whitfield now had a lawyer good enough to make sure this case was handled exactly the way any other hidden run in this county would be handled, no better, no worse. No quiet phone call from a partner's father smoothing anything over. It meant I had already recused myself, in writing, from anything connected to it, so nobody could ever say the judge and the family had protected him. And it meant that whatever happened next in that courtroom was going to happen in the open, in front of a jury of people who had never once been told I had nothing to lose. The arraignment was on a Wednesday morning in October, and I want to tell you honestly that I almost didn't go. Judges do not sit in the gallery of other judges' courtrooms for cases involving their own husbands. It isn't done, and I had spent 4 years building a reputation I wasn't going to spend on a single morning of spectacle. But Marcus Whitfield's daughter had asked me, quietly, in the hallway outside intake 2 weeks earlier, whether anyone from that family was going to show up at all, or whether her father was just going to be a name on a docket that nobody with power in this town had to look in the eye. So I went. Not as a judge. As a woman in the third row of a public gallery, in a plain coat, watching. Eleanor and Walter sat 2 rows ahead of me, on the other side of the aisle, and it took Eleanor 11 full minutes to realize I was in the room because she had never once, in 11 years, actually looked at me long enough to recognize me out of context. When she did, her face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It emptied out. Grant's attorney, not from his own firm, because even Walter had understood that much, stood up when the case was called and did not contest the charge. Grant pleaded to leaving the scene, to failure to render aid, and the assistant DA read the facts into the record in the flat, procedural voice I have used myself 1,000 times. The plate, the paint transfer, the 4 blocks he drove before pulling over, the call his mother placed to his house before anyone placed one to the victim. That last detail wasn't supposed to come out. But somewhere in discovery, Marcus Whitfield's attorney had subpoenaed phone records, and the timeline was right there in black and white. Eleanor's number, dialing Grant's cell, 6 minutes before anyone dialed 911. It went into the record as evidence of what the prosecution called consciousness of guilt and a pattern of concealment, and I watched Walter's jaw tighten in exactly the way Grant's does when he's run out of moves. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I sat in that gallery in my plain coat while the county learned, in the space of 40 minutes, 3 things the Averys had spent 11 years making sure nobody ever had to say out loud in that family, that their son had left a man bleeding on Belmont Avenue and driven home to ask his mother what to do about it, that his mother's first instinct, hearing that news, was to ask his wife to take the fall, and that the wife she'd asked, the one she'd introduced for over a decade as nothing in particular, was the presiding judge of the Northern District, sitting 8 feet away in a public gallery, watching her family's whole architecture come down in open court. Afterward, in the hallway, Eleanor caught up with me by the elevators. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest with you. There was no redemption scene, no moment where she became a different woman. What she said instead, low enough that no one else could hear, was, "You could have told us who you were." "You never asked," I said. "None of you ever asked me anything in 11 years that wasn't really about Grant. I didn't hide my life from your family. I just stopped explaining it to people who'd already decided it didn't matter." Grant took a plea that kept him out of state prison, restitution, license suspension, 2 years of supervised probation, a felony that will follow him into every bar application and business filing for the rest of his life. Marcus Whitfield's medical bills were covered in full, and his daughter sent me a card that fall that I still keep in my desk drawer, not because I did anything heroic, but because for once, somebody in that story got to be seen for exactly who they were, instead of who was convenient. Grant and I separated that winter. Not with a scene. We had already had our scene, in a courthouse hallway, in front of the people who'd spent 11 years underestimating me. What was left after that was just paperwork, and paperwork, unlike people, has never once surprised me. I still sit on that bench. I still sign my name the same way I always have. The only thing that changed is that nobody in that family gets to decide anymore what I have to lose. If someone in your life ever assumed you had nothing at stake, tell me in the comments what happened when they found out otherwise. And if this is the kind of story that gets you, subscribe, because the next one starts with a man who thought his silence was the only thing holding his family together, and he was wrong.